The late afternoon sun reflected off the steel and glass facade of the imposing corporate skyscraper, painting a golden sheen across the bustling city. Inside the lobby of Titan Corp headquarters, a world of sleek marble floors and high-tech security gates, Samuel Whitaker, billionaire CEO and the man at the pinnacle of this empire, brushed an invisible speck from his tailored suit. His jaw clenched as he adjusted his tie. The quarterly earnings call had just ended. Though profits had soared, Samuel was still fuming. One department's failure to meet projections had left a sour taste in his mouth. It wasn't just about the money, it was about control. Perfection. Everyone in the room had felt the sting of his curt, cutting remarks. "Car waiting?" Samuel barked, striding toward the revolving doors. His assistant, a jittery man named Clark, nodded quickly and stammered, "Why yes, sir." "Right outside." Samuel barely acknowledged him, his mind already racing ahead to the next battle on his relentless climb to dominance. As the sleek black limousine pulled up, Samuel noticed something unusual. A young boy, no older than 8, stood near the curb, his backpack askew and his sneakers scuffed. The boy's shaggy brown hair fell into his eyes as he craned his neck, looking up at the massive building with a mix of awe and determination. Beside him stood a woman holding his hand, her face lined with weariness. She wore a threadbare coat that did little to shield her from the crisp autumn air. Samuel stepped into the cool air of the outdoors, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. He was about to climb into the car when the boy suddenly called out, his voice clear and unwavering despite its high pitch. "Hey, sir." Samuel froze, his hand on the car door. He turned slowly, his sharp blue eyes narrowing as they landed on the boy. The woman tried to tug her son away, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Ethan, don't bother the gentleman," she whispered urgently. But the boy didn't budge. He looked directly at Samuel and said with surprising confidence, "My mom has a picture of you in her purse." A ripple of surprise ran through Samuel. "A picture?" Intrigued despite himself, he raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms, towering over the small figure. "Is that so?" The boy nodded, his wide eyes unblinking. "Yup. She says you're famous." "Are you?" Clark, hovering nervously behind Samuel, whispered, "Sir, we're going to be late for your next meeting." "Quiet," Samuel snapped, his gaze never leaving the boy. He turned his attention to the woman, who now looked like she wanted to sink into the sidewalk. "Ma'am," Samuel said, his voice cool but not unkind. "Care to explain?" The woman hesitated, then let out a resigned sigh. "It's nothing, really. Just an old newspaper clipping from years ago. Back when you were in the news for something good." Her words carried a subtle edge, but Samuel's focus remained on her. She had striking hazel eyes, though they were clouded with exhaustion. Something about her felt oddly familiar, but he couldn't place it. "You keep a picture of me?" he asked, intrigued. She hesitated again, then squared her shoulders. "I do. Because I wanted my son to know that people who rise to power start somewhere. You came from nothing, didn't you? You used to say that in interviews." Samuel's jaw tightened. He didn't like being reminded of his humble beginnings. "I did," he admitted curtly. "Then I thought maybe it would inspire him." Her voice was steady now, her earlier embarrassment gone. "But maybe I was wrong." Samuel bristled at her tone, but before he could respond, the boy stepped forward, holding out a folded piece of paper. "I drew this for you," Ethan said. Samuel hesitated, then reached for the paper. It was a crude but earnest sketch of a man in a suit, standing atop a tall building with a crown on his head. Beneath it, in wobbly handwriting, were the words, "Even kings were kids once." For a moment, Samuel was silent. The world around him seemed to fade as he stared at the drawing. Something about it unsettled him, tugging at a part of himself he thought he'd buried long ago. "Ethan," the woman said softly, pulling her son back. "Let's go." Samuel's voice stopped her. "Wait." She turned, her expression wary. Samuel handed the paper to Clark, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. He held it out to her. "Come back tomorrow," he said, his tone unreadable. 10 o'clock. "My office." The woman's eyes widened. "What? Why?" "Because I'm curious," Samuel replied, slipping into the car without another word. As the limousine pulled away, Ethan's drawing resting on the seat beside him, Samuel stared out the window. His reflection in the glass looked back at him, a man who had everything yet felt an unfamiliar pang of something he couldn't name. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd find out why. The next morning, Samuel's office was awash with light streaming in through floor-to-ceiling windows. The room, meticulously arranged and exuding power, seemed to mirror its occupant's personality. Yet, for all its grandeur, there was a faint sense of sterility, a space too perfect to feel lived in. Samuel sat behind a sprawling desk, flipping through reports as the minutes ticked toward 10 o'clock. He had questioned the wisdom of inviting the woman and her son. It had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, uncharacteristic of his usual calculated actions. And yet, here he was, anticipating their arrival with an undercurrent of something he refused to call excitement. A knock on the door broke his reverie. Clark stepped in, his expression a blend of uncertainty and nerves. "Sir, they're here." Samuel's brow furrowed. "Send them in." The door opened, and the woman and Ethan entered, their contrasting emotions evident. Ethan, holding tightly to his mother's hand, seemed both curious and a little intimidated. The woman, on the other hand, wore an expression of guarded determination. "Please, sit," Samuel said, gesturing to the chairs across from his desk. They hesitated for a moment before settling into the plush leather seats. Ethan swung his legs nervously, his gaze darting around the imposing office. Samuel leaned forward, his piercing gaze fixed on the woman. "Let's get straight to it. You've clearly gone through some effort to show me." He glanced at Ethan, then back at her. "To show me something. I'm curious what that is." The woman straightened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'm not sure what you're expecting, Mr. Whitaker. I didn't ask for this meeting." "You did. You said something yesterday," Samuel countered. "About me inspiring your son. About rising from nothing. Do you believe I'm an inspiration?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I did. Once." The admission landed heavily in the room. Samuel's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, waiting for her to continue. "I believed in your story," she said, her voice steady. "How you pulled yourself up from nothing to build all this. It's the kind of thing people like us need to believe in. That hard work and ambition can make a difference." Samuel leaned back, studying her. "But now?" Her hazel eyes met his, unflinching. "Now, I'm not so sure. Somewhere along the way, you stopped being the man in those stories. You became someone who only cares about power and profit. Someone who doesn't look back." Samuel's expression darkened. "And you've decided that based on what? A few headlines? Based on the fact that people like me," she gestured to herself and Ethan, "are invisible to you. We struggle every day, and you don't see us anymore." The room fell into a tense silence. For the first time in years, Samuel felt the sting of criticism that wasn't veiled or filtered through sycophantic deference. Ethan broke the silence, his small voice cutting through the tension. "But you can still be a good guy. Right?" Samuel blinked, momentarily disarmed. The boy's earnest gaze felt like a mirror reflecting back a version of himself he barely remembered. "Maybe," Samuel said quietly, surprising even himself. "Maybe I can." Samuel's words hung in the air, a faint crack in his otherwise impenetrable armor. The woman's sharp gaze softened momentarily, though she didn't dare let her guard down. Ethan, still clutching his mother's hand, smiled brightly, unaware of the emotional minefield his simple question had set off. Samuel cleared his throat and leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. The move was calculated, a CEO returning to his domain. "Mrs. Carly Donovan," she supplied, her tone brisk. "Mrs. Donovan," Samuel began, "you said yesterday that you carry my picture to inspire your son. And yet today, you sit here accusing me of losing my way. If I have indeed failed to see people like you," his voice dipped slightly, "then tell me, what do you want me to see?" Carly hesitated, thrown by the sudden openness of his question. Her fingers tightened on Ethan's, as though drawing strength from his presence. "I want you to remember what it's like to be one of us. To fight every day, not for boardroom wins or profit margins, but just to keep your head above water. That's what I want you to see." Samuel studied her, his expression unreadable. He rose from his chair and turned to face the sprawling view of the city. His silhouette against the sunlight seemed almost regal, yet there was a hollowness to it. "Do you know what it's like to have nothing?" he asked without turning around. "Yes," Carly said simply. Samuel's head tilted slightly at her quick response, but he didn't look back. "I wonder if you truly do." "I clawed my way up from nothing, Mrs. Donovan. No safety nets, no helping hands. Just sheer force of will. And you're right, somewhere along the way, I stopped looking back. Perhaps because looking back means seeing a version of myself I've spent my entire life trying to leave behind." Carly opened her mouth to respond, but Ethan's quiet voice cut through. "But isn't that old you still part of you?" Samuel turned, his gaze locking onto the boy. His words, so innocent yet piercing, hit like a blow. For a long moment, he said nothing, the weight of the boy's question settling in his chest. Finally, Samuel walked back to his desk and sat down, his demeanor shifting from introspective to decisive. "All right," he said, fixing Carly with a steely look. "You want me to see your world? Then show me." Carly frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, take me to where you live. Let me see the struggles you're talking about. Let me meet the people I've supposedly turned invisible." Carly blinked, caught off guard by the challenge. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Samuel replied. "Think of it as a business deal. You want me to understand your world? Then I need first-hand experience. And in return," he paused, considering his words carefully, "I'll see what I can do to help." Carly's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why should I trust you?" "You probably shouldn't," Samuel admitted with a faint smirk. "But trust doesn't have to come first. Action does." Carly stared at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained wary. "Fine. But no cameras, no entourage. Just you." "Agreed," Samuel said, extending a hand across the desk. Carly hesitated, then shook it firmly. Ethan clapped his hands, his excitement breaking the tension. "Does this mean Mr. Whitaker's coming to our house?" "It means," Carly said, standing and smoothing her coat, "he's going to see what life is really like outside this skyscraper." As she and Ethan turned to leave, Samuel called out, "Tomorrow. 8 o'clock. My driver will pick you up." Carly glanced back, her lips pressing into a thin line. "We'll see you then." When they were gone, Samuel sat back in his chair, the boy's words echoing in his mind. "Isn't that old you still part of you?" He picked up Ethan's drawing, still resting on the corner of his desk. The image of the crown atop the building suddenly felt less like a triumph and more like a burden. Tomorrow, he thought, would be his chance to find out if the man he used to be was truly gone, or if there was still something worth saving. The black car idled outside Carly and Ethan's modest apartment building the next morning, its polished exterior a stark contrast to the crumbling brick and peeling paint of the structure behind it. Samuel sat in the back seat, his jaw tight, an unfamiliar nervous energy coursing through him. This was not his world, not anymore, and every instinct screamed that he was stepping into enemy territory. Carly appeared first, dressed in the same threadbare coat but holding herself with the same quiet strength that had caught Samuel off guard in his office. Ethan trailed behind her, clutching his sketch pad. When he saw Samuel through the tinted window, the boy's face lit up. Samuel stepped out, ignoring the curious stares from passers-by. "Morning," he said curtly. Carly eyed him with a mixture of suspicion and defiance. "You didn't have to come all the way here." "I said I wanted to see," Samuel replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Lead the way." As they walked, Carly pointed out the landmarks of their daily life: the dilapidated corner store where she bought groceries with coupons, the overcrowded bus stop she used to get to her cleaning jobs, the playground where Ethan often played alone because she couldn't afford after-school programs. "You see this?" Carly gestured toward the playground, her voice edged with frustration. "This is what you don't see from your penthouse office. These kids, they grow up believing the world doesn't care about them because people like you don't even know they exist." Samuel's gaze followed hers, landing on a rusted swing set where a group of children played. He watched as Ethan climbed onto a swing and pushed off, his laughter ringing out like a small rebellion against the bleakness of the surroundings. "This is where you're wrong," Samuel said, his voice low but firm. "I do know what it's like to grow up like this. But I made a choice a long time ago to never look back." "And that's the problem," Carly shot back. "You've built an empire, but what good is it if you've forgotten what it's for? You had the chance to make a difference, and instead, you chose to protect your own power." Samuel didn't respond. Instead, he followed her into the small community center where she volunteered on weekends. Inside, the air buzzed with activity as children worked on crafts, teenagers tutored one another, and volunteers served steaming bowls of soup to those in need. Carly turned to Samuel, her expression softening but still firm. "This is what you could be doing. You have the resources to change lives, not just boardrooms. But first, you need to decide what kind of legacy you want to leave." Samuel walked slowly through the center, the weight of her words settling over him. He paused by a table where Ethan sat, drawing another picture. "What are you working on now?" Samuel asked, his voice quieter than usual. Ethan grinned and held up the paper. This time, it showed a large tree with roots that extended deep into the ground, intertwined with smaller trees. At the top of the largest tree, a crown rested. Beneath it, Ethan had written, "Strong roots help others grow." Samuel stared at the drawing, something tightening in his chest. It was so simple, yet it carried a truth he had spent years avoiding. "I think," Samuel began, his voice unsteady. "I think I've forgotten what my roots are." Ethan tilted his head, studying the billionaire as if assessing whether he truly meant it. "You can still remember," the boy said simply. The words hit Samuel with the force of a tidal wave. In that moment, he made a decision, not one driven by profit margins or shareholder expectations, but by something he hadn't felt in years: conviction. Turning to Carly, he said, "If I want to help, I need someone who knows this world. Someone who won't let me forget what matters. Will you work with me?" Carly's eyes widened, and for a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Samuel replied. "I've spent years building walls between myself and the people I started this for. It's time to tear them down." Carly searched his face, looking for any sign of insincerity. When she found none, she nodded slowly. "All right. But this isn't about charity. It's about real change." Samuel extended a hand, and this time, Carly shook it without hesitation. As they left the community center, Samuel glanced back at Ethan, who waved enthusiastically. For the first time in years, Samuel felt something he couldn't quite name: hope, perhaps, or the first stirrings of redemption. He didn't know if he could fully bridge the gap between the man he'd become and the boy he'd once been. But as he stepped into the sunlight, Ethan's drawing tucked carefully into his pocket, He knew one thing for certain: he was finally ready to try. If you liked it, subscribe to the channel and enjoy these other amazing stories.